Let's investigate an ancient Chinese example of modular arithmetic. We will use pairs of Chinese characters to label the 60 years of the sexagenary cycle. First, let's introduce the astronomical year number, which is denoted by Y. We will focus on a 12-year period, starting at y equals -6 and finishing at y equals +5. The positive values of y correspond to the Anno Domini, or AD years. So here we have AD 1, AD 2, and so on. Observe that the year 0 is included. This is the additive identity. Y equals 0 corresponds to the year 1 BC. You can compute all of these BC years by evaluating 1 minus y. Observe that the absolute value of the BC year is reduced by 1 when we convert to the astronomical year number. That is why 7 BC corresponds to -6. Let's have a look at this sequence of numbers. Here we can see the final decade of a sexagenary cycle. And we can also see the first 2 years of the next sexagenary cycle. So we're starting at 51, then we go to 60, which is the final year of the sexagenary cycle, and then we restart. And this is the first year of the sexagenary cycle. Observe that the year AD 4 corresponds to the first year of the sexagenary cycle. If we want to synchronize the start of this cycle with y equals 1, so that 1 corresponds to 1 and 60 corresponds to 0, then we have to subtract by 3. So that's why we have y minus 3 mod 60. So this is modular arithmetic, and the modulus is 60. And we need this -3 in order to synchronize the start of this cycle. So this cycle repeats every 60 years. And we can think of this sexagenary cycle as 2 subcycles going simultaneously. We're going to have a 10-year subcycle and a 12-year subcycle. Let's first examine the 10-year subcycle. So over here we can see y minus 3 mod 10. The modulus is 10. So an interesting relationship that we can observe is that if we look at the ones digit of these sexagenary years, that is the same as the value mod 10. So here we have 51, that corresponds to 1. 52 corresponds to 2, and so on. And we get to 60, and that corresponds to 10. And 10 is also the same as 0, mod 10. And then we restart, and we're back to 1 and then 2. So why is this the case? Well, it's because we're using a base 10 representation over here. So if we divide these values by 10, the remainder is given by this ones digit. That's the digit on the right. Now, these values from 1 to 10 can also be mapped to a set of 10 Chinese characters. These 10 Chinese characters are called the heavenly stems. So there are 10 heavenly stems. This is the first heavenly stem, the second heavenly stem, and we can continue this pattern until we get to the 10th heavenly stem. And then after a decade is complete, we restart the cycle, and we're back to the first heavenly stem, and then the second heavenly stem, and we're repeating, and we're in the next cycle. These heavenly stems are also used in other contexts. They can be used to label a 10-day week. So the days in that 10-day week can also be labeled with these characters. But in this context, they are referring to the years in a decade. Now that we've seen this subcycle, which repeats every decade, let's have a look at this 12-year subcycle. Now, this 12-year subcycle is a little more complicated. So that's why we have this pattern over here to help us see the relationship between these sexagenary years and this 12-year cycle. It's also important to observe that we're going to map these values mod 12 to these earthly branches. So we have a set of 12 characters which are called the earthly branches. And they also correspond to animals. The first earthly branch corresponds to the rat. The second earthly branch corresponds to an ox. The third earthly branch corresponds to a tiger. Then the fourth earthly branch corresponds to a rabbit. The fifth corresponds to a dragon. The sixth corresponds to a snake. The seventh corresponds to a horse. The eighth corresponds to a goat. The ninth corresponds to a monkey. The 10th corresponds to a rooster. The 11th corresponds to a dog. And finally, the 12th corresponds to a pig. And then, after this 12-year cycle is complete, we restart and we're back to this first earthly branch, which corresponds to a rat. And then again, we have that sequence, which is rat, ox, and then tiger, and we restart. So this is a 12-year cycle. So observe that these heavenly stems and earthly branches are not always synchronized. You can see this final year, the year 60, is represented as 1012, where we can say that this is the 10th heavenly stem and the 12th earthly branch. So these are not the same value. But then when we go to the first decade of the sexagenary cycle, we're back to being synchronized. So we have 1, 1, 2, 2. So let's have a look at this pattern over here. We're breaking up the sexagenary cycle into 6 decades. The first decade has synchronization. So both the stem and the branch, they correspond to the same value. So here we have 1, 1, 2, 2, 3, 3, all the way to 10, 10. But then when we get to the second decade, they are out of sync. So over here we're dealing with 1, 11, and then 2, 12. So they're no longer synchronized. So this first 12-year cycle is broken up into 10 years and then 2 years. And then the second 12-year cycle is broken up into 8 years and then 4 years. And then this third 12-year cycle is broken up into 2 groups of 6. The fourth 12-year cycle is broken up into 4 years and then 8 years. And finally, the fifth 12-year cycle is broken up into 2 years and then 10 years. And this final decade is what we see over here from 51 to 60. So in this interval over here, we see the final decade and the first 2 years at the bottom. Now, we have 10 characters over here and 12 characters over here. So what are all the possible combinations? We have 10 options for the first one, 12 options for the second. So we have 10 times 12, which is 120 possible combinations. But there are only 60 years in a sexagenary cycle. So that means that only half of the possible combinations are used. So these subcycles, they meet and they synchronize again after 60 years. Now that is because the lowest common multiple of 10 and 12 is 60. So that's the reason that this cycle synchronizes again and repeats after 60 years. And that's also the reason we're only using half of the possible combinations. Out of the 120 possible combinations, we only use 60 of these character pairs to label the years in a sexagenary cycle. Now let's have a look at 3 interesting examples. Now this first example we have already looked at over here. We can see that the year AD 4 corresponds to the first year in the sexagenary cycle, and we can write that as 1, 1, or we can say that this is the first heavenly stem and the first earthly branch. So we can write it as 1 out of 60 or 1, 1, or we can write it as a pair of Chinese characters. And this tells us that we're dealing with the year of the rat. Now, here are 2 example years that get mapped to this year in the Sexagenary cycle. We can see the year 2697 BC. If we convert that to the astronomical year number, we will get minus 2696. So we introduce a minus sign and we reduce the absolute value by 1. So that year corresponds to this first year of the Sexagenary cycle. Another example year that gets mapped to the first year of the cycle is the year AD 1984, or the year 1984. And because I'm filming this video in the year 2025, this is the first year of the current cycle. So the current Sexagenary cycle began in the year 1984. And here we're using the convention AD, which means Anno Domini. So that is starting from here. This is AD 1. Now let's have a look at these two examples. So over here we have the 17th year in the Sexagenary cycle. The 17th year can be written as 7,5. Now, why is that the case? Well, if we perform the mod 10 operation, we have 7. We can see that from the ones digit. And if we perform the mod 12 operation, we can see that this is 5 more than 12. So that is the remainder. That's why we have 7, 5. And in this diagram, we can see that year appearing over here. So this is the 17th year. The 17th year appears in the second decade of the cycle, and it also appears in the second 12-year cycle. So we have 5 over here, and that corresponds to the 7th heavenly stem and the 5th earthly branch. And this second character over here tells us that we're dealing with the year of the dragon. So this is the year of the dragon. And here are 2 example years that get mapped to the 17th year in the Sexagenary cycle. We have the year 221 BC. If we convert that to the astronomical year number, we get minus 220. So this one is the year of the dragon, and we can map it to this pair of numbers. And another example is AD 2000. So it is also the year of the dragon, and it is the 17th year of the cycle. And this year 2000 is actually the 17th year of the current cycle, which we are in right now. Now, let's have a look at this final example. So this is the 42nd year out of 60. Over here, we are in the second last decade. So this is the 6th decade, and this is the 5th decade over here. And we're also in the second last 12-year cycle. So that's this part over here. And you can see that the last digit is 2. So if we apply the mod 10 operation, we get 2. And we also, if we apply the mod 12 operation, we get 6. So that's why we have 2, 6. So the year 42 in this 60-year cycle gets mapped to 2, 6. And that is the second heavenly stem and the 6th earthly branch. And this tells us that we're dealing with the year of the snake. So an example is the year AD 1905, or 1905. So that is an example of the year of the snake. And the current year, AD 2025, or AD 2025, that is also the year of the snake. So in the current cycle, we are over here. We are at the 42nd year of the cycle, which began in the year 1984. So 1984 is over here in the diagram, and this is the current year. So we have seen 3 interesting examples. We have seen how this sexagenary cycle can be thought of as 2 subcycles. We have a 10-year subcycle and a 12-year subcycle. And we have seen the Chinese characters that can be used to represent these numerical values. We have the 10 heavenly stems and the 12 earthly branches. And these characters can also be used in other contexts that are not for labeling years. But this is a very interesting application. So we can see that this is an ancient Chinese example of modular arithmetic, and it is still used today.